The people who break your heart rarely expect to meet the person you become after you survive them. Naomi Brooks adjusted the final candle at the center of the dining table and stepped back to admire the room she had spent all afternoon preparing. Every detail carried meaning. The white linen tablecloth had belonged to her late father, Harold Brooks, who believed that family dinners deserved the same respect as life's greatest celebrations. The polished silverware had been a wedding gift from her grandmother. Even the lemon rosemary chicken resting in the oven came from the handwritten recipe Harold had carefully taught her years before, insisting that love was often remembered through ordinary traditions rather than extraordinary moments. Tonight marked 10 years since Naomi and Ethan Caldwell had promised to build a life together. Their marriage had changed over time, becoming quieter, more distant, and increasingly filled with business trips that lasted longer than necessary, but Naomi had refused to let disappointment erase hope. She still believed difficult seasons could end if two people remembered why they had chosen each other in the first place. She glanced toward the framed photograph of Harold resting on the sideboard beside a vase of fresh white lilies. "I kept the tradition alive, Dad," she whispered softly, "just like you asked." Her phone displayed a message from Ethan sent only 20 minutes earlier. "Running a little late. Please wait for me." Naomi smiled faintly. At least he remembered the anniversary. She poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and checked the roast one final time before hearing a car pull into the driveway. Relief crossed her face. She smoothed the sleeves of her navy blue dress and walked toward the front entrance. The door opened before she reached it. Ethan stepped inside carrying his leather briefcase. Behind him stood a stylish woman in a cream-colored coat holding a bottle of wine. Naomi stopped walking. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Ethan removed his coat as though nothing unusual had happened. "Naomi," he said evenly, "this is Vanessa Reed. We work together." She needed somewhere quiet to discuss an important project after dinner. Vanessa offered an uncertain smile. "It is nice to meet you. I hope I am not interrupting anything." Naomi looked from Vanessa to the dining room, where 2 anniversary candles continued burning quietly. Then she looked back at Ethan. There was no anger in her expression, only the unmistakable sadness of someone watching a truth arrive that she had spent months trying not to believe. Ethan avoided her eyes. "I thought it would be easier this way." Naomi did not ask what he meant, because she already understood enough. Instead, she walked calmly into the dining room, opened the nearby cabinet, removed a 3rd dinner plate, and placed it beside the others. She added another wine glass, another folded napkin, and another chair with the same quiet care she had given every other place at the table. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps I should leave." Naomi looked at her kindly. "You were invited. It would not be polite for a host to send a guest away before dinner." Ethan seemed almost unsettled by her composure. He had expected questions, accusations, perhaps even tears. Instead, Naomi simply invited them to sit. The silence around the table felt heavier than any argument could have become. Just as Ethan reached for his glass, the sound of the front doorbell echoed through the house. Naomi frowned softly. She had not expected anyone else. She opened the front door to find an older gentleman in a charcoal suit, carrying a slim leather portfolio embossed with gold initials. He removed his hat respectfully. "Good evening, Mrs. Caldwell. My name is Daniel Whitmore. I served as your father's attorney for more than 30 years. Naomi's eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Whitmore?" He nodded gently. "Your father instructed me to deliver something personally. His instructions were very specific. I was to come to the first family dinner held after the first wedding anniversary celebrated without him, and I was told every person seated at the table must remain present before I opened this portfolio." Daniel glanced past Naomi toward the dining room, where Ethan and Vanessa sat frozen in complete silence. Then he quietly added, "Your father believed that sometimes the truth arrives only after everyone has chosen exactly where they wish to sit." Daniel Whitmore waited until everyone had taken a seat before placing the slim leather portfolio carefully beside Naomi's untouched dinner plate. The warm meal she had spent hours preparing slowly cooled as the room filled with a silence that seemed almost intentional. Ethan looked toward the attorney with visible confusion. "I was not aware Harold had left anything unfinished." Daniel met his eyes politely. Your father-in-law completed every legal matter before his passing. What I am delivering tonight is not unfinished business. It is a scheduled instruction. Naomi gently rested both hands on the edge of the table, still trying to understand why her father had chosen this particular evening. Daniel removed a sealed ivory envelope bearing Harold Brooks's unmistakable handwriting across the front. It simply read, "For Naomi, to be opened only when the family is gathered exactly as life chooses to arrange them." Daniel slid the envelope toward her. These were your father's exact words. He insisted that I never interfere with whatever circumstances existed on the evening this letter was opened. Naomi carefully broke the seal. The familiar handwriting immediately brought tears to her eyes before she had even begun reading. She quietly took a slow breath and started reading aloud, because Daniel explained that Harold had specifically requested every person present hear every word. My dear Naomi, if you are reading this, then I am no longer able to remind you of something I spent your entire childhood trying to teach. A person's true character is rarely revealed on ordinary days. It appears when someone believes they have the power to embarrass you without consequence. When that day comes, do not compete with their anger. Protect your dignity instead. The people who remain calm when their hearts are breaking often understand themselves better than the people who believe they have won. Naomi paused as emotion tightened her voice. Across the table, Vanessa quietly lowered her eyes, suddenly realizing the evening carried far more meaning than she had ever imagined. Harold's letter continued. If the table feels uncomfortable tonight, leave every chair exactly where it is. Never ask someone to move simply because they exposed who they truly are. Truth is a guest that deserves a place at every table. Ethan shifted uneasily in his chair. Daniel remained completely silent, allowing Harold's words to fill the room exactly as intended. Naomi continued reading. You may wonder why I asked for this letter to be opened during a family dinner, instead of inside a lawyer's office. It is because meals reveal relationships better than meetings ever will. Watch carefully who speaks. Watch carefully who listens. Watch carefully who chooses honesty when silence would be easier. Naomi slowly folded the first letter, unable to continue for several seconds. Daniel finally spoke. There is one additional instruction attached to that letter. He removed a second sealed document from the portfolio. Unlike the handwritten envelope, this one carried official legal markings. Ethan instinctively leaned forward. What is that? Daniel answered calmly. A legal declaration connected to the Brooks family trust. Naomi looked up in surprise. My father never mentioned any trust. Daniel nodded gently. That was intentional. Ethan frowned. I thought Harold retired with a modest pension. Daniel looked toward him with professional composure. Many people believed that. Vanessa quietly glanced toward Ethan, noticing uncertainty replacing the confidence he had carried into the house only an hour earlier. Daniel rested one hand on the unopened legal envelope before continuing. Your father instructed me not to discuss its contents until his first letter had been heard in full. However, I am authorized to tell you one thing before this document is opened. Every person at the table looked toward him. Daniel's voice remained steady. Everything your father arranged was completed almost 7 years ago, long before anyone in this room realized why tonight would matter. Ethan felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest as he looked toward the unopened envelope. For the first time that evening, he was no longer wondering what Harold had left behind. He was beginning to wonder how much the man had quietly understood, while everyone else believed he had noticed nothing at all. Daniel Whitmore carefully broke the wax seal on the legal envelope and removed several neatly prepared documents, each bearing Harold Brooks's signature, alongside official notarization, completed 7 years earlier. He adjusted his glasses before speaking in the measured voice of a man who understood that every sentence carried the weight of someone's final wishes. This document establishes the Brooks family trust. Mr. Brooks instructed that its contents remain confidential until this exact evening. Naomi looked at the papers in quiet disbelief. My father never mentioned creating a trust. Daniel nodded gently. He intended it that way. He believed generosity is strongest when it is never used to influence another person's decisions. Ethan leaned forward. What exactly is included in the trust? Daniel glanced at him politely before answering. Several long-term investments, commercial real estate interests, municipal bonds, and ownership shares in Brooks Structural Consulting, the engineering firm your father quietly helped build before retiring. Over the past decade, the assets have been professionally managed. Ethan frowned. He had always believed Harold lived comfortably but modestly. Nothing about his late father-in-law had ever suggested extraordinary wealth. Daniel continued. The current estimated value of the trust exceeds $38 million. Complete silence settled over the dining room. Vanessa slowly lowered the wine glass she had been holding. Ethan stared at Daniel as though he had misunderstood the number. Naomi herself looked equally stunned. "That cannot be right," she whispered. "Dad lived in the same small house for 30 years. Daniel smiled softly. "Your father often told me that appearing ordinary allowed him to observe extraordinary truths about people." He slid another page toward Naomi. "The trust has one primary beneficiary." Naomi looked down and found her own name printed clearly beneath the heading. Daniel continued reading. "All assets transfer exclusively to Naomi Brooks Caldwell upon fulfillment of the activation condition established by Harold Brooks." Ethan finally asked the question everyone had been thinking. "What is the condition?" Daniel turned to the final page. "The trust becomes irrevocable on the first evening. Naomi willingly chooses dignity over humiliation, while surrounded by every person necessary to reveal the true condition of her marriage." Ethan's expression slowly changed from confusion to disbelief. Vanessa looked toward him, then back to Naomi. Realizing the condition, somehow described the evening unfolding around them with unsettling precision. Naomi quietly covered her mouth with one hand. Daniel spoke gently. "7 years ago, your father told me he hoped this condition would never be satisfied. He prayed I would eventually destroy these documents because your marriage would flourish and render them unnecessary." Ethan lowered his eyes for the first time that evening. Daniel unfolded one final handwritten page attached behind the legal declaration. "There is another personal note your father requested be read only after the trust became active." Naomi nodded silently. Daniel began reading aloud. "My dear Naomi, if these words are reaching you tonight, then life unfolded in the one way I begged it not to. You may wonder why I created a condition instead of simply leaving everything to you immediately. It is because I never wanted money to become the reason you stayed in a marriage or the reason you left one. I wanted your decision to belong entirely to your own heart. If this trust has awakened tonight, then I know you endured the hardest part before receiving the easiest part. Remember this always. Wealth cannot restore dignity after it has been surrendered, but dignity can build a life that no amount of money could ever purchase." Daniel carefully lowered the letter. Naomi sat motionless, as tears quietly filled her eyes. Across the table, Ethan looked at the woman he had married 10 years earlier and suddenly realized Harold had never built the trust to reward success or punish failure. He had built it to protect the daughter he understood better than anyone else, long before the rest of the room finally began understanding her too. No one reached for the dinner that Naomi had prepared with such care. The candles continued burning with quiet steadiness, while Daniel Whitmore carefully gathered the legal documents into neat order, leaving Harold Brooks's handwritten letter resting beside Naomi's plate. She traced the edge of the paper with her fingertips, recognizing the familiar way her father always crossed the letter T with a long, deliberate stroke. It felt as though he had somehow anticipated every emotion now filling the room. Daniel opened the leather portfolio once more and removed a small cedar box, no larger than a jewelry case. "There is one final item your father instructed me to deliver tonight," he said softly. Naomi accepted the box with both hands. The scent of cedar immediately reminded her of the tiny workshop behind her childhood home, where Harold had spent weekends restoring antique furniture. Inside rested an old brass key attached to a faded leather tag bearing only one handwritten word: Foundation. Beneath the key lay another folded letter. Naomi unfolded it carefully while everyone remained silent. "My dear Naomi, if you are holding this key, then you have already discovered that I trusted your strength more than I trusted circumstances. This key opens the office inside Brooks Structural Consulting that I never allowed anyone to renovate after my retirement. Everything inside belongs to you now. I asked Daniel to preserve it exactly as I left it, because sometimes the answers we need are found in conversations that finished years earlier. Naomi looked toward Daniel with quiet surprise. "You kept his office untouched all this time?" Daniel nodded. "Exactly as he instructed. Even the calendar remains open to his final working day." Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair, trying to understand how carefully Harold had arranged every detail without drawing attention to himself while he was alive. Daniel continued, "There is something else your father believed you deserved to know before you entered that office." He removed a thin folder labeled Confidential Correspondence. Several years before his retirement, Mr. Brooks privately became an advisor to Caldwell Hospitality during a difficult expansion period. He never accepted public recognition or a permanent executive position. He insisted his role remain confidential. Ethan frowned with disbelief. "That is impossible. I reviewed our company history after becoming chief executive officer. I never saw his name," Daniel answered calmly. "Because Harold specifically requested that every consulting agreement remain anonymous. Your board honored that request." Daniel slid several signed consulting records across the table. Ethan examined the signatures and instantly recognized the legal documents as authentic company records. His voice became almost a whisper. "These recommendations helped save our Chicago development project." Daniel inclined his head. "They also prevented 2 acquisitions that independent analysts later concluded would have severely damaged the company." Ethan slowly lowered the papers, realizing that one of the men he had quietly dismissed as an ordinary retired engineer had contributed to the stability of the business that built his own reputation. Naomi looked at the documents without triumph. Instead, sadness quietly settled across her face. "Dad never told me any of this." Daniel smiled gently. "He once explained why. He said that if people respected him only after learning his accomplishments, then they had learned nothing worth remembering." Vanessa finally spoke after remaining silent for much of the evening. Her voice carried genuine regret. "Ethan told me your father had been a kind man, but I never imagined someone could possess this much wisdom without ever speaking about himself." Naomi folded the latest letter with great care before placing it back inside the cedar box. She looked toward the empty chair where her father would once have offered everyone another serving before changing the subject to something lighter. The absence hurt more deeply than ever, yet for the first time since his passing, she felt his guidance more clearly than his loss. Daniel quietly closed the portfolio before saying one final sentence. "Your father believed the office would answer questions that none of these letters could explain. However, he also instructed me to warn you that what you discover there may permanently change the way each person at this table understands the past." The clock on the dining room wall quietly marked another passing minute before Vanessa slowly placed her untouched wine glass on the table and looked directly at Naomi. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. "Not because of what happened tonight, but because I accepted a story without ever asking whether it was complete." Ethan turned toward her with surprise. "Vanessa, this is not your responsibility." She met his eyes calmly. "I think it is. You told me your marriage had become nothing more than paperwork and routine. You said both of you had already accepted that it was over and were simply waiting for the right time to move forward." She paused before continuing. "Nothing about this evening feels like the story I was given." Ethan remained silent. Naomi did not interrupt. She simply listened. Vanessa looked back at Naomi. "When I walked through your front door, I expected discomfort. I did not expect to find someone who had spent hours preparing an anniversary dinner." Her eyes briefly rested on the carefully arranged table. "I certainly did not expect to discover a woman who continued treating me with kindness after every reason to do otherwise." Daniel quietly gathered the legal papers while allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. Harold Brooks had often told him that truth required very little assistance once people finally chose honesty over pride. Ethan slowly stood from his chair and walked toward the living room window. Outside, the porch light illuminated the front garden Naomi had planted during their second year of marriage. He remembered helping her spread fresh mulch one Saturday morning before work, gradually became the center of every decision he made. Success had arrived exactly as he once dreamed. Yet somewhere along the journey, he had begun measuring achievement by quarterly reports instead of quiet evenings like this one. Without turning around, he finally spoke. I convinced myself that growing apart happened so slowly it no longer mattered. Naomi answered gently, "Growing apart always matters. We simply notice it too late." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. I kept telling myself I would explain everything after another business trip, after another acquisition, after another board meeting. Every conversation became something I believed could wait until tomorrow. Naomi looked at the anniversary candles still burning steadily between them. Eventually, tomorrow becomes years. Vanessa quietly picked up her handbag. "I should leave." Naomi rose from her chair. "Allow me to walk you to the door." Ethan looked surprised, but neither woman waited for his response. At the front entrance, Vanessa stopped before stepping outside. "I do not expect forgiveness," she said honestly. Naomi offered a small, sincere smile. "You apologized for your own choices instead of defending them. That matters." Vanessa hesitated before asking one final question. "Are you going to stay?" Naomi looked toward the dining room, where Harold's letters remained beside the untouched meal. "Tonight is not about deciding my future. Tonight is about finally seeing the present clearly." Vanessa nodded with quiet understanding before leaving. The front door closed softly behind her. When Naomi returned to the dining room, Ethan was carefully reading Harold's handwritten letter again. This time he moved slowly through every sentence, instead of searching for the legal implications hidden beneath the words. Daniel watched him with professional patience before speaking. "Mr. Caldwell, your father-in-law left one private instruction addressed specifically to you. He instructed me not to deliver it unless you remained in this house after everyone else had the opportunity to leave." Ethan looked up immediately. "There is another letter?" Daniel reached inside the leather portfolio and removed a smaller envelope bearing Ethan's name, written in Harold's unmistakable handwriting. Unlike the others, this envelope remained sealed with dark blue wax. Daniel placed it gently on the table but did not release his hand. "Harold made one request before you read this." Ethan looked at him carefully. "What request?" Daniel's expression remained calm. "He asked that you first answer one question honestly, with no audience to impress and no reputation to protect." The room fell completely silent as Daniel slowly withdrew the envelope and quietly asked, "If you could return to the moment before you opened your own front door this evening, would you still choose to walk inside exactly the same way?" Daniel Whitmore did not repeat the question. He simply waited with the quiet patience Harold Brooks had admired for decades. Ethan looked at the sealed envelope resting beneath Daniel's hand, before finally lowering his eyes toward the anniversary table that Naomi had prepared with such care. The candles had burned lower now, yet their steady light somehow made every untouched plate appear even more significant. After a long silence, Ethan answered in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, "No." Daniel nodded once, neither satisfied nor surprised. "Would you explain why?" Ethan slowly exhaled. "Because I spent months convincing myself that honesty could be delayed without becoming dishonesty. I believed avoiding one difficult conversation would somehow protect everyone involved. Instead, I created something far more painful." Naomi remained completely still. She had imagined hearing those words many times over the past several years, yet now that they had finally been spoken, they brought neither relief nor triumph. They simply sounded late. Daniel gently released the envelope and slid it toward Ethan. "Your father-in-law instructed me to deliver this only after hearing a truthful answer. He wrote that if your response was sincere, then perhaps the letter might still accomplish what he hoped." Ethan carefully opened the envelope and unfolded a single handwritten page. Harold's familiar script covered both sides. Ethan quietly began reading aloud, because, just as with Naomi's letters, Harold had requested that every important truth be shared openly. "Dear Ethan, if you are reading this, then I know something painful has happened inside the home where my daughter once believed every promise you made. Before you continue, understand that I never expected perfection from you. I only hoped you would value honesty before comfort. Every marriage experiences disappointment. Very few are destroyed by disappointment alone. They are usually undone by silence, pride, and conversations postponed until trust quietly disappears." Ethan paused as emotion tightened his voice. Daniel encouraged him with a gentle nod, and Ethan continued. I watched the way you looked at Naomi during your first years together. You respected her opinions even when they challenged your own. Never lose that man, I prayed. Success has a subtle habit of convincing good people that they can postpone love until life becomes less busy. I have lived long enough to know that life rarely becomes less busy. We simply discover too late which moments deserved our full attention. Ethan closed his eyes briefly before reading the final paragraph. If my daughter eventually decides her future no longer includes you, respect that decision completely. Love is never proven by persuading someone to remain after you have stopped protecting their heart. However, if she chooses a different path, earn it through years of consistent character rather than beautiful speeches. Regret may begin with words, but redemption is always measured by actions. Tits 20. The room fell silent once more. Naomi quietly wiped away a tear, not because the letter changed her feelings, but because every sentence sounded unmistakably like her father. Ethan carefully folded the page exactly along its original creases before placing it beside Harold's other letters. He understood me better than I understood myself, he admitted. Daniel looked toward Naomi. There is one final instruction before my responsibilities are complete. He reached into the portfolio and removed a small envelope addressed jointly to Naomi and Daniel. Inside rested a brass key card and a handwritten appointment card. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, Daniel explained. Mr. Brooks requested that both of us accompany you to his preserved office at Brooks Structural Consulting. He instructed that no one else enter until you had personally unlocked the door with the key he left you tonight. Naomi looked down at the old brass key resting inside the cedar box. She had believed the evening's greatest revelation was already behind her. Yet as Daniel gathered the remaining documents, she realized her father had not been preparing her merely to inherit what he had built. He had been patiently leading her toward a truth that still waited behind a locked office door, one he believed would finally explain everything he had never found the right moment to say while he was alive. The following morning arrived with a quiet gray sky that seemed determined to hold the city in thoughtful silence. At precisely 9 o'clock, Naomi stood outside the historic Brooks Structural Consulting building beside Daniel Whitmore. The brick facade looked almost unchanged from her childhood, when she had raced through its front doors after school, carrying drawings she insisted her father display in his office. Time had weathered the building, but it had not erased its dignity. Daniel unlocked the main entrance before stepping aside. Your father instructed that only you use the brass key. Naomi reached into her purse, removed the worn key Harold had left behind, and walked slowly toward the office at the end of the hallway. The leather tag still carried the single handwritten word, Foundation. Her hands trembled only slightly as she inserted the key into the old brass lock. The mechanism turned with surprising ease. The office door opened quietly. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating shelves lined with engineering books, framed blueprints, and carefully organized journals. Harold's reading glasses still rested on the corner of his oak desk, beside a fountain pen and a cup holding several sharpened pencils. Even the calendar remained open to his final working day exactly as Daniel had promised. Naomi stepped inside with measured breaths, feeling less as though she had entered an abandoned office than a conversation waiting patiently to continue. Daniel remained respectfully near the doorway, while Naomi slowly explored the room. Every object reflected her father's quiet discipline. There were no expensive decorations, no displays celebrating professional success, only photographs of bridges, buildings, family vacations, and one framed picture of Naomi wearing her college graduation cap, while Harold smiled with unmistakable pride beside her. Beneath the photograph rested a small envelope marked, "Open only after you have seen the room exactly as I left it." Naomi carefully unfolded the letter. My dear Naomi, before you search for answers inside these cabinets, I want you to notice what is missing. There are no trophies, no awards, no newspaper articles celebrating achievements. I removed them years ago because accomplishments are temporary visitors. Character is the only permanent resident. Naomi smiled through quiet tears. That sentence sounded exactly like something Harold would have said across the dinner table on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Daniel gently pointed toward a large wooden drafting cabinet standing against the far wall. "There is one drawer your father instructed me never to open." Naomi walked toward it and discovered another brass lock matching the key already in her hand. She unlocked the drawer and slowly pulled it open. Inside rested dozens of neatly labeled journals arranged by year. Beneath them lay a thick blue binder titled Caldwell Hospitality Advisory Notes. Ethan's company name immediately caught her attention. Daniel stepped closer. "Your father documented every recommendation he made while serving as an anonymous consultant." Naomi carefully opened the binder. Each page contained detailed engineering evaluations, financial risk analyses, handwritten calculations, and meeting summaries extending back nearly a decade. Tucked inside the front cover rested another sealed envelope addressed to Ethan. Naomi looked toward Daniel with surprise. "There is another letter for him?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, but Harold instructed that Ethan could receive it only if someone other than himself chose to deliver it." Naomi looked down at the envelope for several quiet moments. She remembered every painful conversation that had never happened, every lonely anniversary, every promise slowly buried beneath busier schedules. Yet she also remembered her father's final lesson that dignity never required revenge. She gently picked up the envelope and placed it beside Harold's journals. "I will give it to him," she said softly. Daniel studied her expression before asking one careful question. "Have you already decided what comes next?" Naomi closed the drafting drawer with deliberate calm. "Yes." Daniel waited. Naomi looked around the office one final time before answering with peaceful certainty. "I have decided that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same decision." As they prepared to leave, Daniel quietly noticed one final item resting beneath the journals that neither of them had seen before. It was a sealed architectural blueprint bearing Naomi's name, along with a handwritten note from Harold that simply read, "This is the future I always hoped you would build when you were finally free to choose it for yourself." 3 weeks passed before Naomi asked Ethan to meet her one final time. She chose neither a law office nor an expensive restaurant. Instead, she invited him to the quiet courtyard beside the architecture school, where she had first told her father that she wanted to spend her life designing places where people could feel safe. Autumn sunlight filtered through rows of old maple trees as Ethan arrived carrying the sealed envelope Harold had addressed to him, still unopened. He looked older than he had only a month before, not because of time but because regret had finally replaced certainty. Naomi noticed immediately that he wore no business suit, only a simple navy sweater and dark jeans. For the first time in years, he looked less like the chief executive officer everyone admired, and more like the young man she had once fallen in love with. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. Naomi nodded before handing him the second envelope she had discovered inside Harold's preserved office. "My father wanted you to receive this only if someone else decided you deserved to read it." Ethan accepted it carefully. "You could have destroyed it." Naomi smiled gently. "That would not have honored the man who wrote it." Ethan slowly opened the envelope. Harold's familiar handwriting covered only a single page this time. "Dear Ethan, if Naomi has placed this letter into your hands, then she has already demonstrated the kind of character I always hoped would guide her life. Never mistake her kindness for permission to repeat old mistakes. She is offering you respect, not another chance. What happens after this moment depends entirely on the man you choose to become when no one is watching." Ethan continued reading with quiet concentration. "I have enclosed copies of every advisory report I prepared for your company because they no longer belong hidden inside my office. They belong to the future leaders, who may one day discover that the strongest businesses are built by people who value trust before profit. If you truly wish to honor my daughter, begin by honoring the people who place their confidence in you every single day." Ethan lowered the letter slowly. "He was still teaching me," he whispered. Naomi nodded. "That was who my father was." They walked together for several minutes without speaking. Eventually, Ethan stopped beside a stone bench overlooking the campus gardens. "I met with the board yesterday," he said. "I resigned as chief executive officer." Naomi looked at him with quiet surprise. "Why?" he answered honestly. "Because I realized I had become successful in ways that cost me the person I respected most. I need to rebuild my character before I try leading anyone else again." Naomi studied his face. For the first time since the painful anniversary dinner, she believed his words were no longer attempts to repair a marriage. They were attempts to repair himself. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed his wedding ring. He did not offer it to Naomi. Instead, he placed it gently in his own hand. "I finally understand what your father meant," he said softly. "Redemption is measured by actions, not speeches. I cannot ask you to wait while I become someone different." Naomi looked toward the students crossing the courtyard with rolled blueprints tucked beneath their arms. "You do not need my permission to become a better man." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know." Naomi reached into her handbag and removed the completed divorce papers she had quietly signed that morning. She placed them in his hands with calm dignity. "I forgive you, Ethan," she said gently, "but forgiveness allowed me to let go of the pain. It did not erase the path that brought us here." Ethan accepted the documents without argument. He understood that the conversation was ending, not because Naomi had stopped caring, but because she had finally learned to care for herself with the same kindness she had always offered everyone else. As they prepared to leave, Daniel Whitmore called Naomi with unexpected news. The architectural blueprint Harold had hidden beneath the journals had been reviewed by structural historians. It was not merely an unfinished design. It was the complete master plan for a community learning center Harold had dreamed of building with his daughter, a project he had quietly funded years before and arranged to begin construction the moment Naomi decided she was ready to build a future entirely of her own. 1 year later, the first rays of autumn sunlight stretched across the glass entrance of the Harold Brooks Community Learning Center, as families, students, teachers, architects, and local business leaders gathered for its dedication ceremony. The building stood exactly where the old blueprint had imagined it decades earlier, transformed from careful sketches into a place filled with classrooms, design studios, engineering workshops, and scholarship offices for young people whose dreams had once seemed larger than their opportunities. Naomi stood quietly near the entrance before the ceremony began, gently running her hand across the bronze plaque bearing her father's name. Beneath it were the words Harold had written years before inside one of his letters. "Character is the only permanent foundation." Daniel Whitmore approached with a warm smile. "Your father would have loved this morning." Naomi looked toward the students already exploring the building through its wide glass windows. "I think he planned this morning long before I understood I was capable of building it." Daniel nodded softly. "He believed your greatest inheritance would never be measured in dollars." Guests slowly filled the courtyard until the ceremony began. Among them stood Ethan Caldwell, dressed simply in a charcoal suit, without the executive confidence that had once defined him. He had accepted no place of honor and requested to sit with the general audience. Over the past year, he had quietly rebuilt his life away from headlines, serving on nonprofit construction projects that renovated community housing and mentoring young business graduates about ethical leadership. He rarely spoke publicly about his personal mistakes, because he had learned that genuine change required consistency rather than attention. Vanessa Reed attended as well, now leading communications for a charitable education initiative unrelated to Ethan's former company. Months earlier, she had written Naomi a thoughtful letter expressing gratitude for the grace she had shown on the hardest evening of all their lives. The two women had never become close friends, but they had become something equally valuable. Two people who respected one another, because honesty had finally replaced misunderstanding. Naomi stepped to the podium as the audience grew quiet. She looked across the faces before her, before lifting the folded page she had carried inside her handbag since the night Daniel first arrived at her front door. "My father once wrote that wealth cannot restore dignity after it has been surrendered, but dignity can build a life that money could never purchase." For a long time I believed those words were simply good advice. Now I understand they were an invitation. She smiled gently toward the students seated in the front rows. "This building exists because one man believed education should never depend upon circumstance, and because he trusted that compassion becomes stronger when it is shared." Warm applause filled the courtyard. After the ceremony ended, Ethan quietly approached Naomi holding a small wooden box. "I wanted to return something," he said. Inside rested the wedding ring he had removed months earlier. It belongs to the chapter we finished with honesty. Naomi looked at the ring before carefully closing the box again and placing it back into Ethan's hands. "Keep it," she said softly, "not as a reminder of failure, but as a reminder of what truth eventually teaches." Ethan nodded with grateful understanding. There was no lingering hope that the past might return. There was only quiet respect between two people who had finally accepted different futures. As the guests gradually departed, Naomi remained standing outside the learning center until the evening light reflected across the glass walls her father had once imagined only on paper. She reached into her coat pocket and found the old brass key Harold had left inside the cedar box. The key no longer opened any locked office because that chapter had ended, yet she carried it as a reminder that every meaningful door in her life had opened only after she chose courage over bitterness and dignity over revenge. She smiled toward the building filled with voices, ideas, and possibilities before slipping the key back into her pocket. At that moment, she understood her father's final gift had never been the trust, the property, or the fortune he quietly protected for her. His greatest gift had been teaching her that when life asks you to choose between proving someone wrong and remaining true to yourself, the strongest foundation you will ever build is the one created by grace. Because every life constructed upon dignity becomes a home that no disappointment can ever take away.